Welcome to this lesson. In this lesson, let's take a look at a very fun concept called functions. A JavaScript function, function is a block of code that performs something like, let's say, calculations, comparisons. It could be any kind of function. So within the function, you perform some kind of operation. It's used for a lot of purposes in programs. Functions are a very important concept in pretty much every programming language there is because they have a lot of benefits. One of the main benefits is that they save lines of code, a lot of lines of code, and they save you time in writing codes and in execution as well. Since a function can be called again and again to execute the same block of code within them any number of times. So you write a block of code within a function once, and then you can execute it multiple number of times. There is no end to the number of times you can call it, depending on your need. So imagine the number of lines of code you will save because of just that one block of code you wrote. So there are two parts to a function. One is the function definition, and then the second one is the function call. So the function definition defines the function name and the block of code within it. Then there is the function call, which calls or invokes the function, and the function calls are the only way to execute the lines of code within a function definition. So let's look at some examples so you understand how this works. So first of all, let's look at function definition. To define a function, you'll first write the function keyword, so function, and then the function name, like this, with two parentheses at the end. Then the block of code will be written within two flower brackets, like this, just like you do with your loops and conditional statements. So this is how the syntax of a function definition is written. So to call a function, this is how you do it. Let me leave some space between these. You have to call a function after you defined it. So below the function definition, you can call a function by writing function name, so whatever the name of the function is, and then a parenthesis, and end it with a semicolon. You don't have to include semicolons after the flower brackets, just like you don't have to in your loops and conditional statements. So let's create a simple function that prints values now. So function, instead of the function name, I'll change the name to print hello. I've written it in camel casing again, and within this the block of code is going to be just one line, an alert statement that would say hello there, and end it with a semicolon. So now I'm going to call the function. If I don't call it, the alert statement within the function won't be executed at all. This would not be traversed at all by your browsers unless and until you call this function. So let me call it. We're writing the function name, print hello, and then ending it with two parentheses and a semicolon. So let's look at the output now. Let me first save this. So let's look at the output. Great, see, we get an alert that says hello there because this print hello call actually called this function to print that alert. So it works. Now let's see if we can send values to these functions. So for that, let me first delete all of these. We're going to create another function. Before that, I'm going to be assigning some values. Assigning some variables some values. So var num1 is equal to 5, and then var num2 is equal to 6. So I've created two variables with values 5 and 6. Now I'm going to define a function called sumNum. So function, the name of the function is sumNum, but this time within the parentheses, I'm going to include two values to indicate that the function receives values with each function call. So these values will then be used to perform calculations or whatever is necessary within a function. So function sumNum, and then within that two variables called n1, n2, and then let's write our block of code. So let's create another variable called sum, and then the value of sum is going to be n1 plus n2. which we got from our function call in here. Okay, and then finally return sum. So as you can see here at the end of this function definition, I've used a keyword called return with a variable sum. So what this does is, this return statement is used to send the output or the outcome of the function code back to the calling statement. There can only be one return statement within a function though, because as soon as the return statement is encountered in a function block, the execution will come out of the function. Alright, so any lines of code in the function block that are after the return statement will not be executed. So if I have an alert that says hello in here after this return statement, it won't be executed no matter how many times this function is called, because it's after the return statement. So once the return statement is encountered, the execution of the function would come out. So the function won't be executed anymore. So now let's delete this because it won't work anyway. And then let's create our call. So sum num. So this is how you'd usually do a call, am I right? So but this time we are going to be assigning this call to a variable. So the value of the sum that's sent by the function right here with the return statement would get stored in the variable. So for that, let's declare a variable called valSum, and then assign it the value of sum num. But there's something missing here. Our function actually takes up two values, n1 and n2. So we need to send those two values from our function call. So we can do that by sending the values of num1 and num2 that we created. So don't confuse these two variables with these two variables. So these are arguments that you are sending to the function. Okay, so these need to be created beforehand before you can send it. But the variables within a function definition, the ones that we are receiving, you don't have to define it or you don't have to create it. Alright, so that's why I just wrote n1 and n2 without actually declaring the variable beforehand, because they are not variables as such. So after this, let me create an alert that says the sum of the number is, and concatenate it with valSum, value of valSum. Alright, let me give a space in here. So there's space between is and valSum. Let me just explain everything for a second. So first of all, the line of execution would be like this. The variables would be created and then assigned. Okay, but the function definition would not be traversed at all because it hasn't been called yet. So it will come here and then it will encounter valSum and then the function call in here, and then it will go back to the function definition. So now that it's in the function definition, that is the browser, it'll execute all the statements of the function definition. So it'll get the values of n1 and n2 from the function call, and then it'll create the variable sum and then add and store the value of sum. And finally, the browser would encounter the return statement. So when it encounters the return statement, the execution of the function stops right there. So it'll return the value of sum back to our function call. So our sum num will have the value of sum num. Okay, so that value will now be assigned to our valSum, and finally there would be an alert which displays everything we want to display. So that's how the execution works. So let me show you the output so you can see if it works or not. There you go. The sum of the number is 11. So it works perfectly. But before I started this topic, I told you that a function can be called any number of times, and I haven't showed you how that works. So for that, let me just do another call. Okay, in this case I'm going to be calling within an alert statement. So I'm just gonna say sum num of, instead of creating two more variables, I'll just give two parameters like this. So sum num of 3, 4, so the values of 3 and 4 will be assigned to n1 and n2 respectively, and this call would then finally return the value of sum right here, which would then be alerted. So let's see if that works. So we have to get two alerts this time. Alright, so let me save this first. That's our first alert. That's our second alert. So just the value 7, because that's what we alerted. So as you can see here, we had two different function calls. So we performed two different operations two times, but we only used one block of code. So that's how you save ton of line of codes with a function call, because you can call the same function even 100 times, and every time it'll just go back and call this function, so you don't have to write any more extra lines of code at all. So that's it for functions. I haven't by any means covered the complete function topics at all. It's a vast topic, but I've covered enough so you don't feel lost when we code. So you can consider this as a very basic overview of the functions topic. So in the next topic, let's look at some other interesting JavaScript concepts. So I'll see you there. Thank you.